Russia described itself as a gas station with an army. Now that gas station is running dry, and the question at the heart of this war is whether a military machine can keep fighting when the fuel powering it is vanishing from beneath its own feet. Ukraine's almost daily long-range drone and missile strikes, using domestically developed weapons, have battered Russian oil facilities and brought a fuel crisis that is embarrassing the Kremlin more than 4 years after Russia's all-out invasion. The strikes didn't start with a single dramatic moment. They built, layer by layer, refinery by refinery, until one day the queues outside Moscow's gas stations were a kilometer long, and Russian soldiers at the front were being handed 20 liters of fuel and told to make it last. Ukraine conducted at least 194 drone strikes on Russian oil refineries in the first half of 2026 alone, a figure reported by the Financial Times, citing analysis and data from Polish analytical group Rochin Consulting. That number needs to sit for a moment. 194 confirmed hits on the infrastructure that powers everything: cars, farms, tanks, aircraft. The number of refinery strikes during the first half of 2026 was 11 times higher than during the same period the year before. That's not an escalation. That's a transformation of the entire campaign's character. And the question now is exactly how deep this wound goes and what it means for the war itself. Follow the chain from the drone in the sky to the soldier stalled at the front line, because that's the chain Ukraine has been systematically severing. Ukraine's deep strike campaign on Russia's oil facilities was officially launched in early 2024, with a few dozen pilotless aircraft per month. In those early days, the hits were occasional, enough to cause disruption, not enough to cause crisis. Moscow repaired what it could, rerouted what it couldn't, and told the Russian public that everything was under control. The cumulative total stood at 108 hits after 3 years of war, then 246 after 4 years. The acceleration is the story. What took 3 years to reach 108 strikes took less than 6 months to nearly double again. Ukraine had figured something out, not just how to reach these facilities, but how to hit them fast enough that Russia couldn't repair them before the next wave arrived. Independent oil and gas analyst Boris Ehrenstein said the Ukrainian drone strikes had caused what he described as the most severe crisis in recent years, adding that the size, coordination, and repeated waves of the drones make Russia unable to repair the refineries before the next attack occurs. That's the mechanism. It's not about any single explosion. It's about the relentless pace, the repair crews who arrive to find another strike already inbound. So, which facilities took the hits that mattered most? The geographical distribution of the damage matters enormously. Loss of production capacity has been particularly acute around Moscow, with all the refineries supplying refined oil to the capital via pipeline, Yaroslavl, Ryazan, and Kstovo, damaged in attacks. That's a deliberate squeeze on the nerve center of Russian power. Moscow is the nexus of Russia's fuel consumption. About 14% of Russia's 53 million passenger cars are registered in Moscow and the Moscow region, and 40% of the country's air passenger traffic goes through the Russian capital. Damage those 3 pipelines into Moscow, and you don't just hurt the economy, you put the crisis on the doorstep of the people closest to the Kremlin. Then came June, and the campaign shifted from the outskirts to the center. Ukrainian strikes on the oil refinery in Moscow's southeast Kapotnya district in early June 2026 signaled a new phase in Kiev's campaign against the Russian oil industry. Kapotnya isn't some remote facility in Siberia. It sits inside the city limits of Moscow. Smoke rising from a refinery within the Russian capital isn't a logistical problem. It's a political statement. Russia's Lukoil Nizhegorod-Nefteorgsynthez refinery, the 4th largest oil refinery and the 2nd largest producer of gasoline in the country, had been struck by Ukraine on June 24th, forcing operations to shut down. On July 2nd, Ukrainian drones paid another visit, forcing the facility to shut down once again. The second strike arrived before the first round of repairs was even complete. Gazprom's Omsk oil refinery, approximately 2,445 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory, and the largest such facility in the country, was struck by Ukrainian drones 4 days later, on July 6th. Critical parts of the refinery, such as the primary oil refining unit, took direct hits, causing a halt in production. 2,445 kilometers. That's the range Ukraine's domestically built drone fleet is now operating at. The Kremlin's assumption that Siberian facilities were safe was gone. It was the sixth major Russian oil refinery to partially or fully shut down since the start of June alone. 6 facilities, 1 month, across every time zone of the country. The war machine's fuel supply wasn't being chipped at, it was being dismantled. And if you want to see how Russia's war economy responds when the pressure keeps mounting, stick around, because what Moscow did next tells you exactly how panicked the situation had actually become. Ukraine struck all 10 of Russia's largest oil refineries in 2026, impairing up to 42% of refining capacity. Read that again. Not some refineries, not most refineries, all 10 of the largest. The full list. Oil market analysts estimate Russia processed about 3.95 million barrels of crude per day in June, roughly 25% less than a year earlier, and the lowest level in more than 2 decades. A quarter of the country's refining throughput, gone. By July 2026, Bloomberg, citing Energy Aspects Analytics data, reported that Russia's crude processing rate had slipped further still, to 3.91 million barrels per day, more than 1.5 million barrels per day below last year's average. Industry estimates suggest Russia is now producing roughly 85,000 metric tons of gasoline daily, while peak summer demand approaches 110,000 metric tons, creating a daily shortfall of about 25,000 metric tons. That gap, every single day, is the pressure bearing down on every truck driver, every farmer, every soldier expecting a fuel delivery. The domestic consequences became impossible to hide. By July 2nd, Novaya Gazeta Europe estimated that the fuel crisis had spread to at least 78 of the 83 internationally recognized regions of the Russian Federation, plus occupied Crimea and Sevastopol. 5 regions had escaped the crisis. 78 had not. Sales at Russian gas stations became limited to about 20 to 30 liters per vehicle, and drivers had to pump fuel strictly into vehicle tanks. Filling jerry cans was largely prohibited. These aren't wartime austerity measures targeted at the front. These are measures targeted at grandmothers trying to fill up in Moscow, at truckers carrying food to grocery stores in Novosibirsk, at farmers trying to run tractors during harvest season. The crisis escalated in the middle of 2026, with Russian-controlled Crimea declaring a state of emergency in June and banning fuel sales altogether. Crimea, the peninsula Russia fought to seize and has held since 2014, declared a fuel emergency. Russia suspended civilian shipping through the Don Azov shipping canal and the Kerch Strait, following concentrated attacks on oil tankers in the Sea of Azov and surrounding anchorages. When Ukraine set its sights on tankers, it didn't just target physical ships. It cut off the maritime resupply route that Moscow had quietly been relying on to move fuel into the occupied south. Ukrainian drones set 2 oil tankers ablaze in the Sea of Azov, with one ship still burning as crews were evacuated. The maritime corridor that once brought fuel quietly around the southern flank was now a target zone. Moscow's response was frantic and, crucially, revealing. The Russian government banned gasoline exports starting April 1st, a measure originally set to remain in effect until July 31st. Amid the fuel crisis triggered by Ukrainian strikes, Russian authorities then banned diesel fuel exports starting July 8th. Gasoline banned in April, diesel banned in July. A country that once exported petroleum products to the world was now hoarding them for itself. Russia then extended its ban on gasoline exports until the end of 2026, with Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak making the announcement through the Russian state news agency TASS. The ban that was supposed to last 4 months, from April to July, is now locked in for the entire year. Exports of jet fuel are banned until the end of November. Gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, all 3 major refined product categories. Off the export market, all of them, as Russia scrambles to keep its own population and its own army moving. A decree was signed allowing certain oil refineries to lower their production quality standards from Euro 5 gasoline to Euro 3 gasoline until the end of the year. That's not a technicality. Euro 3 is a lower-grade fuel standard abandoned by most of Europe years ago. Russia is now accepting dirtier, lower-grade output from damaged facilities just to keep production numbers from collapsing further. Now, a note of balance, because honesty requires the other side of the ledger. Russian regions began cautiously reporting an easing of the gasoline crisis after Ukraine shifted the focus of its attacks from major oil refineries to ships. From Russia's Black Sea coast to deep within Siberia, local leaders reported higher fuel availability and more stable supplies. While rationing remained in force, allocations for gasoline sales per car were gradually increasing in some areas. Russia's system is not broken beyond function. It bends under sustained pressure. It reroutes, it downgrades standards, it hoards, and in some windows, when the strike tempo eases, it catches breath. Yet the fundamental math doesn't change. According to industry sources, Russia's total gasoline production at the beginning of July fell to about 65% of the average seasonal demand, after several months of production lagging behind demand. And on July 29th, the strikes resumed, hard. Ukrainian forces struck Rosneft's refinery in Ryazan, some 120 kilometers from Moscow, and Lukoil's refinery in Perm, about 1,500 kilometers east of the Russian capital. Ryazan, which had already been hit multiple times, was burning again. Perm, deep in the Urals, was now in the target set. The campaign didn't end when Ukraine shifted to tankers, it expanded. The most consequential layer of this crisis isn't the gas station queues. It's what's happening at the front. Ukraine's sustained strikes on Russian oil refineries are now affecting fuel supplies for Russian troops, with service members reporting gasoline shortages and restrictions on refueling military vehicles. According to the independent Russian outlet Verstka, several Russian service members said fuel deliveries have been cut, limiting both combat operations and logistics. Russian soldiers describe what they call a catastrophic shortage of fuel at the front lines. Far less is available, it's more expensive, and it's only being issued for vehicles officially owned by the army, excluding vast numbers in use. Soldiers interviewed by the independent Russian news site Verstka say the situation has become a complete mess. Just like civilians, the military is now being rationed to only 20 liters of gasoline per vehicle per day. 20 liters. That's not enough to run a meaningful armored patrol. It's not enough to conduct a sustained logistics push. It's not enough to fight a war at the tempo Russia needs. Analyst Jade McGlynn put it this way: for 4 years, Russians in major cities have been able to treat this war as something that happens to other people, somewhere else, paid for with other people's sons. Fuel rationing across Russia ends that, because when you're sitting in a petrol queue for the better part of a day, the war stops being an abstraction on the evening news. The Kremlin's own people said the quiet part out loud. On June 30th, Sberbank Chief Executive Officer German Greff told shareholders at a meeting that he didn't believe there was anyone in the country whose primary concern was anything other than an end to military hostilities as soon as possible. That's Russia's biggest state-controlled bank. Its chief executive, in a shareholders meeting, saying Russians want the war to end. That sentence alone is worth more than any battlefield map. Despite severe fuel shortages across Russia, President Vladimir Putin appears unbothered by Ukraine's increasing attacks on his country's oil refineries, shrugging off the setback for one of the world's leading oil-producing nations as, in his words, not critical, while dismissing ceasefire proposals and insisting the war will continue until his goals are met. The question this campaign ultimately poses isn't just military, it's political. Ukraine has found a way to make the war real for ordinary Russians, not through propaganda, but through empty pumps and hours-long waits, and 20-liter rations for soldiers who used to get as much as they needed. For the Kremlin, the current fuel crisis and diminished revenues necessitate tough choices to balance military needs with basic societal ones. That trade-off, military versus civilian, is one no wartime government can sustain indefinitely without consequence. The markers to watch now are straightforward. Whether Ukraine returns its strike tempo to the refineries after the July pause, whether Russia's harvest season fuel crunch forces Moscow to redirect military supply to civilian agriculture, and whether the Ryazan and Perm strikes on July 29th land more structural damage than the Kremlin can absorb before winter demand arrives. The war machine runs on fuel. Ukraine has figured out that the surest way to slow it down is not to fight it head-on at the front, but to drain its tank from 1,500 kilometers away, one refinery at a time. Is Ukraine's fuel campaign the decisive weapon that turns the war's economic tide? Or is Russia's sheer scale just too vast to break by air alone? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want to follow how this campaign unfolds through the coming months, whether the strikes intensify again, whether the military rationing reaches a breaking point, or whether Moscow finds a way to patch enough capacity to stabilize, subscribe, because this story is nowhere near its final chapter.